Hello, biology students. So this is chapter 17 that we're jumping into here. It's called the ectothermic vertebrates. We'll talk about that term ectothermic here in a little bit. But first, what we get to is chapter 17a, an introduction to phylum Chordata. And we'll talk about phylum Chordata here in just a little bit. First, though, I have 5 questions that I want you to answer as we go through the video. You do not have to write down the questions. All you need to do is give me the answers. And random times in the video, I will tell you what the question is, and then I'll tell you the answer. Not even necessarily in order, just at different times. I'll say something like, number 4, here's the question, and then the answer is, and then you write down the answer, and then submit that in Google Classroom. And yeah, just different tidbits about what we're talking about. Let's see. I also wanted to mention that I am not planning to give you a test on chapter 17 or chapter 18. So we'll go through these videos. You watch, pay attention. This first one, I don't have any like embedded little sub videos for you to watch, but next time we will. And oh, and then you'll also have your regular homework assignments, your review questions to answer based on what we're going through. Okay, so let's jump into this. Phylum Chordata. So, Phylum Chordata, also known as the chordates, and the three key characteristics of chordates is first a dorsal notochord, a dorsal notochord, and what that is. So, dorsal, that's a term that we've already talked about before. Um, Dorsal, like of or pertaining to the back. So, if you think like a dog, the dorsal side would be at the top. If you're thinking us, because we're upright, the dorsal side is toward our back. Um, Hold on just 1 second. Let's see. Yeah. So, dorsal notochord. It is a rod of tough, flexible tissue running the length of the animal's body and serving as his primary support. So, it is the thing like gives the main aspect of structure and support to the main part of the animal's body. So in some chordates, the notochord stays as tough, flexible tissue throughout their entire life. There are only a few that are like that, but most, the notochord is replaced by the vertebrae, which combined make up the vertebral column. So that's where we end up talking about. Usually, when we think of phylum Chordata, we think of the vertebrates. In other words, animals that have vertebrae, animals that have backbones. But not all chordates form a backbone. In some, it stays as like a soft but tough and flexible tissue structure. Okay? All right, so that's that. And I am going to go ahead. No, not yet. I was going to give you an answer to a question, but not quite yet. All right. And so that's the first key characteristic. Second key characteristic, a dorsal tubular new nerve cord. So in other words, there is a cord of nerves that is in the shape of, and sometimes enclosed inside of, a tube. In us, we call that our spinal cord. And then also for pharyngeal pouches. These are folds of skin along the neck during embryonic development. And even humans, when we're first developing as an embryo, we form these kind of like, yeah, pouches that are around where our neck is starting to form. They kind of resemble gills in some way, and that's where a lot of evolutionary biologists used to say that, oh, look, as the human embryo is developing, it forms these structures that kind of look like gills. That's because we evolved from fish, and we are like mimicking or kind of going through a little like brief summary of our evolutionary history by at one point kind of resembling fish because we have gills, and then another point as the nerve cord is forming, as the spinal cord is forming, there's kind of like a tail, and that's like when we were like other animals, like chimpanzees. It is reviewing that aspect of our evolutionary history. And the schmancier term for that they use is phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny, which is kind of like saying the development of a single organism kind of reviews its evolutionary history, but there is no credence to that other than, whoa, some organisms as they're developing as an embryo have some structures that don't even really look like gills, don't function as gills, they're just kind of these folds of tissue. But anyway, okay, moving on. Phylum Chordata the chordates. So we have classification within the phylum. First, there's subphylum Cephalochordata. You might remember cephalo of relating to the head. So Cephalochordata. The main characteristics we have here is a notochord remains throughout the lifetime. So it never develops into vertebrae. And these are filter feeders, and the main example that we have is the Amphioxus, which is also known as the lancelet. Amphioxus or the lancelet. All right, so that is that. And yeah, they swim around in the water. They get up to, I want to say, maybe good 4 to 6 inches long. Sometimes they also kind of burrow their bodies down into the rocks or soil at the base of the water and kind of peek up. But yeah, they cycle water into their digestive system. They filter the food out. All right, so that's subphylum Cephalochordata. Next, there's subphylum Urochordata, or sometimes it's called subphylum Tunicata. And the tuna here is based on the word tunic for like a cloak. They have a like a cloak kind of a structure that is somewhat hard and that covers their body. And the main thing about them is the notochord remains through the larval stage, but then once they are no longer larvae, then the notochord goes away. In this case, they do not develop vertebrae. And yeah, you have three examples of different types of tunicates here, or sea squirts, and they're pretty. They like almost kind of look like coral or something like that, but they don't form the same kind of structures that coral does. And sometimes they're kind of see-through, sometimes they're not. They use siphons for also filter feeding. So kind of like when we talked about clams, how there's the in-current siphon, the ex-current siphon, or when we talked about sponges, the in-current pores and ex-current pores, a similar thing here, where they cycle water through their bodies and they filter food out of the water. And on that note, I'm going to give you the answer to number 5. Number 5, the question would be, what do some people call the colonial tunicates? So that would be like the right-hand side picture here. That would be a colony of tunicates. So what do some people call the colonial tunicates that break loose and wash up on the beach? So sometimes these colonies of tunicates break loose, and then the ocean currents wash them up onto the beach. And the answer is sea pork. Sea as in like the ocean, SEA, sea pork. Don't know exactly why, but that's what some people call it. They washes up in some parts of the coastal parts of the country. They say, "Oh, look at the sea pork." Yes, that's the answer to number 5. Okay, moving on. We have finally subphylum Vertebrata. Subphylum Vertebrata. So, what distinguishes them? They develop vertebral columns, usually before they are born or hatched. And examples that I have here are frogs. It's a cute little frog picture that I found. Giraffes. That's a picture I took at the Sacramento Zoo. And sharks. So, these are all different examples of subphylum Vertebrata. And here's where I'm going to give you the answer to number 1. Number 1. The question would be, what percentage of animals are vertebrates? So in other words, if we look at the entire kingdom Animalia, so chapter 16, well, 15 and 16, those two chapters were about the invertebrate animals, and now we're starting to look at the vertebrates. So if we look at all of kingdom Animalia, all the different species, what percentage of the species are vertebrates? And the answer is 5%. 5%. Yeah, all the different animal species, vertebrates only make up 5% of them. Okay, moving on. So a little bit more about subphylum Vertebrata. Here we are classifying vertebrates based on body heat. And we have two main categories, ectothermic and endothermic. The ectothermic animals are also known as the cold-blooded animals, and they do not have the ability to regulate their body temperature. Instead, they rely on the temperature of their environment. So, in other words, if it gets too cold where they are, their body temperature drops too much. They become very lethargic because their blood is no longer able to carry oxygen very well. And if they get too hot, if like the temperature is too hot outside, their body can get too hot and it can cause damage to their organs, stuff like that. And so what they have to do is they have to do various types of things in order to make sure that they don't get too hot or too cold. So if it's too cold outside, they have to seek a warmer place for them to go. Maybe they like burrow underground if underground is warmer. If it's too hot, maybe they find a place in the shade. Um, you maybe have seen lizards do something where it's like, what are they doing? But what the lizards are doing is they're helping to regulate their body temperature. You maybe have seen lizards do something that kind of looks like they're doing push ups. And they're like in place and they're like push up and then down and then up and then down. And what they're doing is they're borderline getting too hot. Their body temperature is being elevated too much, and a lot of that is because there's a lot of heat radiating off of the ground. So what they do is they push up to get farther from the ground, and also to allow a little bit of air to blow between the ground and them, and it helps to cool their body down just enough to where they're maintaining their body temperature in a good spot. So that is going to be the answer to number 4. Number 4, what do some lizards do to regulate their body temperature? What do some lizards do to regulate their body temperature? And the answer is push ups. Okay. So that's ectothermic. And I give you some examples of ectothermic. Amphibians are ectothermic. For example, frogs and salamanders. Reptiles are ectothermic. Lizards and snakes, and then fish are also ectothermic. So this chapter, after we're done with this introductory part, 17b, and I forget what other, 17b, c, and d, we're going to be focusing on fish, amphibians, and reptiles in that order. And then some vertebrates are endothermic, and we also call that warm-blooded. And so they have various mechanisms for generating and regulating their body temperature. So it's like we have internal metabolic stuff that helps raise our temperature when it's too cold outside. But then we also have different things like sweating or panting to help dissipate heat to lower our body temperature when it's too hot outside. So examples of endothermic animals are birds and mammals. And mammals, things like elephants, tigers, mice, and even us. All right, so that's classifying vertebrates based on body heat. Next, we have looking just real briefly at what are the different classes of subphylum Vertebrata. And there's class Agnatha, and those are called the jawless fish. We'll look at those a little bit, and they have this weird and kind of gross thing where they secrete this really sticky glue when they're in danger or being attacked. And anyway, and then next there's the cartilaginous fish, which is class Chondrichthyes. And then there's the bony fish, class Osteichthyes. And so chondra, with the cartilaginous fish, chondra basically means like cartilage. And then ichthys is the Greek word for fish. And then the bony fish, oste, think of like osteoporosis, and yeah, that is of oste is of relating to the bones, and then ichthys, fish again. And this relates to church history with the fish becoming a symbol used for Christianity. And it's because the early church had this saying that was Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. And when you do an acronym of that, Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior, when you do that acronym in Greek, it ends up forming basically the word ichthus. And so they use the fish with the ichthus acronym meaning God, Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. And this kind of relates to number three. Number three, which class of vertebrates has the most species? So we're saying of these different classes on this list here, which one has the most different species? And the answer is bony fish. Bony fish. All right, and then there's also class Amphibia with the amphibians, class Reptilia with the reptiles, class Aves with the birds, and class Mammalia, also known as the mammals. So that's what we'll look at when we talk about the vertebrate animals. Jawless fish, cartilaginous fish. Oh, I didn't mention an example of cartilaginous fish would be sharks. Sharks are very similar to fish, but there are some very distinct differences, and one of them is, well, very similar to bony fish, which is like the main thing that you think of when you think of fish. But key difference, instead of actually forming bones, they just have very thick cartilage, strong cartilage. So like the bridge of your nose, for example, is cartilage. It's hard, it's almost like a bone, but it's technically not bone. Um, okay, moving on. And then we look briefly at vertebrate form and function, some of the different aspects that are common to vertebrates. First of all, support and movement. There are two main groups of the skeleton of vertebrates. There's the axial skeleton, and that's made up of the vertebral column, the skull, and the ribs. So your basically your backbone, your head, and your ribs. That's your axial skeleton. And your appendicular skeleton are the different things that attach to that. And two main categories. There's the pectoral girdle, so that would be like your clavicles and your shoulder blades and your arm bones. And then the pelvic girdle, that would be like your pelvis or your like your hip bones and your leg bones. So the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. And then some of the terms that relate to circulation in vertebrates. There are arteries, and they carry blood away from the heart. There are capillaries. They are terminal branches of the arteries. They're tiny, thin walled vessels. When we say thin walled, oftentimes we mean literally one cell thick of a layer, and the capillaries pass through the body tissues. So it's the capillaries, they're so small and the walls are so thin that once the red blood cells get into the capillaries in the midst of body tissue, the oxygen is able to dissolve straight through the capillary wall and into the tissue that needs the oxygen. And then veins carry blood back to the heart, and hemoglobin. This is the red pigment in red blood cells, and it carries the oxygen in the blood. So that is why blood is red. Blood is red because of the hemoglobin, because the hemoglobin molecule is a pigment molecule that reflects red light, and so the blood ends up looking red because the hemoglobin is red. And kind of a common misnomer that a lot of people have, just because a lot of diagrams show it this way, is oh, oxygenated blood is red and deoxygenated blood is blue. And one thing that makes a lot of people think that is when you see the veins slightly underneath your skin, they look blue. But the reason why they look blue is not because the blood that is flowing through the veins actually is blue, but rather because the thin layer of skin over the veins reflects, or rather absorbs, a lot of the different colors of light that hit the skin, except not the blue light. And so what happens is you have all different colors of light that strike the skin and then that penetrate into the skin just long enough to bounce off of the vein. And then after it bounces off the vein, that's why we can see the vein, but the colors except for blue end up getting largely absorbed by the skin. And so what's left for what we see of the vein is the bluish color. But if nothing else, like if you've ever had your blood drawn, your blood gets drawn from a vein. And you can even have a bluish looking vein, but then once you insert the needle and you draw the blood comes out kind of a deeper red. Deoxygenated blood is like a duller or deeper red, whereas oxygenated blood is more of a vibrant, bright colored red. All right, moving on. Oops. Okay, good. Then another way of categorizing vertebrates is based on how they get their nutrition. So they're carnivorous vertebrates, also known as carnivores, and they are animals that feed on other animals. There are herbivorous animals, animals that eat plants. We call them the herbivores. And then there are the omnivores, or the omnivorous vertebrates, and they are animals that eat both plants and animals. Okay. And then we can categorize things based on reproduction. So the three categories that we have here are oviparous, viviparous, and ovoviviparous, which I think is kind of a funny name. I'm not sure of any other words I can think of that have three different V's in it like that. It'd be an awesome Scrabble word if you could have enough letters and if there are even three V's in Scrabble. I'm not quite sure. All right, so oviparous. They are animals that produce offspring from eggs that hatch outside the body. So, animal lays an egg, the egg develops, and then the offspring hatches out of the egg that is outside of the body. And this is birds and most fish and amphibians and reptiles. So, most fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Let's see. So, fish and this kind of relates also to two different types of fertilization. There's internal fertilization and external fertilization. In other words, sometimes the egg from the mother gets fertilized inside the mother's body. Sometimes the egg from the mother gets fertilized outside the mother's body. And that's like what most fish do, where the mother releases tons and tons of eggs. And then the father comes along and near where the eggs are releases a bunch of what's called milt. um, it is a substance that has a bunch of the sperm cells in it, and that process is called milting. And then some of the sperm make it to some of the eggs, and fertilization happens outside. And then amphibians. Speaking of amphibians, I'm going to give you the answer to number two. So the question is, what is the smallest adult vertebrate found so far? What's the smallest adult vertebrate that we have found so far? And the answer is a frog. There's a species of frog that scientists found in Papua New Guinea where in its adult state it's about the size of a regular housefly. So so think of like a fly, that maybe landed on your counter, and instead of a fly, imagine it is a frog that is that size. The thing is super cute. It's so tiny. When it's on a quarter, it like takes up like not even half the size of a quarter. Like 25 cents kind of quarter. Yeah. Anyway, so those are oviparous animals, and the next viviparous animals. These are animals that produce live offspring that have been nurtured to birth by the mother's uterus or other similar structure. As most mammals, that's how we give birth. That's how like whales give birth. Um, that's how elephants give birth. Stuff like that. Okay, so the baby develops inside the mother's body, and then the developed baby the mother gives birth to. And then the third category, ovoviviparous. This is like kind of a combination of the two. So what happens is initially the young is inside of an egg, but the egg is inside of the mother's body. So I have your animals that produce live offspring that were not nurtured through a direct connection to the mother. In other words, the offspring develops in an egg inside the mother, and then while it's still inside the mother, the offspring hatches from the egg, maybe does a little bit more developing, but then is born as a developed baby. And most sharks, if not all sharks, are like this. The platypus is a classic example that is like this, and the garter snake. Okay. And then nervous system. A few different terms and structures here. Common parts of the nervous system of vertebrates, a lot more developed than most other kinds of animals as far as the nervous system is concerned. There are olfactory lobes, and they receive impulses from the smell receptors. So that's what allows us, or at least interprets our sense of smell for us. And then there's the cerebrum that controls voluntary muscle activity. When we talk about muscles, we'll talk about this in more depth later, but there are muscles that we can control and there are muscles that we cannot control. Then there are some muscles that we can control, but also keep working even when we're not controlling them. Like, for example, we, let's see, if I'm not actively doing anything to like move my arm muscles, my arm isn't going to move. It's just going to sit there. Whereas your diaphragm that controls your breathing, you can control it. You can decide to take a deeper breath and hold it, but it also keeps working even if you're not actively trying to control it. So thankfully, when you're asleep or when you're unconscious, you keep breathing even though you're not controlling your diaphragm. And then there are some muscles that we just cannot control, like your different digestive muscles. Thankfully, that I don't have to sit there. I mean, imagine if like all those different muscles you had to like consciously think like, okay, heart, beat, beat, beat. Oh wait, diaphragm, breathe, breathe, breathe. Digestive muscle, like the muscle that serves as the connection between your stomach and your small intestine. Like, ooh, open that to let some food through. Okay, now close. Now open it to let. Oh wait. Keep heart, keep breathe. Oh man, So thankfully, a lot of the involuntary stuff our brain does for us. Then there are optic lobes, and they receive the impulses from our eyes. In our case, our optic lobe is in the back of our head. It's one of the reasons why if you get hit hard in the back of the head, you can see stars because you're jostling the optic lobe. Then there's the cerebellum, and it coordinates muscle activity and some involuntary activities. And then your medulla oblongata that transports impulses to and from the spinal cord, including some reflexes. And that is chapter 17a. So that should also give you what you need for doing your homework. And yeah, so write down the 5 answers and get that submitted for this assignment. And I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you next time.